that my wife and I came here to spend a weekend with y'all, and that was the first time my wife and I had ever been in Michigan. And so we spent some time that Friday meeting with people from the church. We spent time Saturday morning meeting with more people from the church. And then on Saturday night, before I was going to preach in order to be voted on, we had some couples from the church that took my wife and I down to Holland for dinner. And then later on, we headed over to Captain Sunday, and I realized that there was something missing in my life that I needed, and that something was Captain Sunday and all of its deliciousness. But in between dinner and finding that void in my life I didn't know was there that could only be filled with Captain Sunday, in between those two things, we went out to Lake Michigan. And it was the first time I had ever been to Lake Michigan in my life. And so we're driving there, and we're going past Lake Makatawa, and I asked, "Oh, is that part of the lake?" And the Michiganders in the car laughed at the silly Pennsylvanian at that moment, and I realized why they laughed at me a couple of minutes later when I was standing on the shores of Lake Michigan. It was awesome. Just massive. Beautiful. And it was also one of those days where the lake was ripping, like the red flags were flying because you could die if you swim in that stuff. And so like I'm facing the power of this thing that I've never seen before. And I had this feeling, it's a feeling that's really hard for us to describe, but you know it when you feel it. Wonder. Wonder. I was in awe of what I was looking at. I was amazed by it, delighted in it, curious about it. I felt a little hint of terror in there. You ever been there? You ever experienced something like that in your life? Like that sense of wonder and that feeling of, it's that feeling of feeling small, but not like you feel insignificant or worthless, but it's kind of that good, comforting feeling of feeling small. You ever been there? You want to know what's fascinating? I don't feel that anymore when I go to Lake Michigan now. Like 2.5 years later, I'm standing in the water, not wondering what I'm seeing. I'm wondering why in the world that water is always so stinking cold, no matter when you go there, no matter what time of year it is. I've lost that wonder that I felt initially, and that can easily happen when it comes to God. Where when we look at God, we are looking at someone who is more powerful, more beautiful, more majestic, and more amazing than any lake, canyon, or solar system in our universe, and we don't even bat an eye. So like I said, my goal in this series is for us to recover the godness of God to whatever extent you need to in your life. And that's why the biggest thought I want you to have through this series, it's the biggest thought I want you thinking about as you leave this place today, is simply this: God is greater than we think He is. No matter how great or awesome or beautiful or wonderful you think God is this morning, I promise you He's more. So let's turn to that passage we had read for us earlier, Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 through 2. Grab your device, grab your copy of the Scriptures, and go there. And what we're going to do is we're just going to walk through that text, phrase by phrase, because I think what it's going to do is whet our appetites for what we're going to talk about for the next several weeks. Where we read in Genesis 1:1 earlier, it says, "In the beginning, God." In the beginning, God. God's greatness is on display in those 4 words. Like there is a ton of stuff being said about God. Let's just reflect on some of it for a minute. What this is saying, first of all, is that God is eternal. He's timeless. God has no start date and He has no end date. He just is. Now, that's hard for us to comprehend. It's hard for us to grasp. Like it's easy for us to grasp the idea that God created everything, but inevitably the question comes up, well, what created God? Where did God originate from? And the answer to that question is nowhere. No one created God. He just is. God doesn't have a birthday, so to speak. Like in the beginning, when there was nothing, God was. And if He's eternal, if He's timeless, if He's just existed, then what that means is that God is also self-existent. He just exists in and of Himself. Nothing created Him. He is the uncaused cause of the universe. And if that's the case, that means that God is also self-sufficient. What I mean by that is God doesn't need anything within his existence. He doesn't need water. He doesn't need food. He doesn't need matter. He doesn't need energy. He doesn't need fuel. He doesn't even need us as human beings. He simply exists in and of himself. And if that's true, if God is eternal, if he's self-existent and sufficient, then what that means is that God is unchanging. That he doesn't change. If he precedes all things, then there is nothing that can exert its force on him in order to make him change. Let me explain it this way. You and I change simply because of the weather. Like you wake up in the morning, you check your phone, and depending on what it tells you the weather is that day, you might have to change some plans. You might have to change your clothes. You might have to get your coat out of the closet or put it back in the closet. You might have to go a different way to work or leave earlier for work. Your mood might even be affected by what the weather is, depending on how cloudy or sunny it might be. And that's not the case for God. He doesn't change because of the weather. He never gets cold and has to put a coat on. He never has to change his plans, and his mood certainly isn't changing based upon how sunny or how cloudy it might be. The weather cannot exert its force on God to make him change because he's the source of the weather. And if that's true, then there's literally nothing in the world, in all of creation, that has the power to exert its force on God and to make him change. When we read the words, "In the beginning, God," we are reading that God is eternal, self-existent, and sufficient, and that he is unchanging. But that's not all we learn about God in Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, because it tells us that in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So here we learn more stuff about God from created in the heavens and earth. So this eternal, self-existent, self-sufficient, and unchanging God decided to create. And that word created is really important because if you look at it in the rest of the first portion of the Scriptures called the Old Testament, you're going to find that that word is only used in reference to God. That only God creates this way, that he created in a unique way that we do not, because God created everything. Everything in life, everything in our natural world finds its source in God. Now, if that's true, then that means some different things about God. First of all, it means that he's all-powerful, that he has all the power that you could possibly need to create the greatest and brightest star down to the butterfly. And if God is all-powerful, that also means, like if he's all-powerful enough to create, then that also means that he's all-knowing. That he has all the knowledge that you could possibly need to not only create, but to run the universe. Let me try to illustrate that by sharing with you this. Shortly after we moved here, I had a very patient and kind person who tried to teach me how to play euchre, the card game. It did not go well at all. Like there are so many moving parts in that game, and so like trumps and suits and combinations and all this stuff that I was just blown away. But I was also blown away by the person trying to teach me, because they were making moves and seeing stuff like 3 things ahead that I would never be able to catch on my own. Why? Because they were all-knowing when it comes to euchre. Like they knew it all. They knew how to play the game more than I did. And here's the thing, God is the master euchre player. Not just the master euchre player, he's the master of everything because he knows all that you could possibly know, even more than what we could possibly understand in order to run everything. And if that's the case, if he's all-knowing and he's all-powerful, and he uses that all-knowingness and that all-powerfulness to sustain his creation, that also means that he's ever-present. That he never leaves. That he's always with his creation and sustaining it, because if he didn't, creation would descend back into chaos and the dust from whence it came. And then if you put all of those things together, all-powerful, all-knowing, ever-present, you have to realize that that means that God is sovereign. That he is reigning and ruling over every aspect of his creation. He's in complete control of it to the extent that nothing happens in all of God's creation without him saying yes. Do you see it? Do you see how great God is? Does this make you wonder and awe at Jesus, at God, the way that you might wonder and awe at a lake or a canyon or even something like your first kiss? See, this is why God is willing and able to point out the fact that He's really different than us. He's willing and able to point out the fact that He's greater than us. Let me show you, I'm not making that up. Isaiah chapter 40, verse 25, God says, "To whom will you compare me, or who is my equal, says the Holy One." Isaiah 46, 9 and 10, God Himself adds this. He says, "Remember what happened long ago, for I am God and there is no other. I am God and no one is like me. I declare the end from the beginning and from long ago what is not yet done, saying, my plan will take place and I will do all my will." God Himself declares that He is far greater than we can possibly imagine. So let's just think about that for a moment. Look at this list. This is God's resume for who He is. I just want you to do something with me for a second. Bring your resume into your mind right now. Whatever you've got, bring it up. Lay it next to that for a second. Does it compare at all? Like, I'm just going to speak for myself for a second. My resume doesn't compare at all. Because I lay it down and I've got some faults I bring to the table, and even the things that are good that I bring to the table don't compare to this. You too? Like, does your resume stand up to this at all? Okay, now, think with me for just a moment about the most powerful black hole in the universe. The greatest human being that you could ever imagine. The most powerful storm you've ever seen. Do their resumes compare to this one? Do they stand up at all to this God of the universe? None of it compares to Him. Why? Because God is God, and there is no one like Him. What we're talking about here is technically called God's transcendence. It's the idea that God is greater than us. He's mightier than us. He's other than us. He's more awesome than we are. And what's interesting about that is there's a theologian, A.W. Tozer, who puts this really well. He says, come up with your list of the greatest beings in the universe from top to bottom. Like, just start listing in your head the greatest being and then start going down to the least greatest being on your list. And Tozer says that when you do that, God shouldn't even be on your list. Because the gap that exists between whatever's on top of your list and the bottom of your list is exponentially greater than the gap that exists between God and whatever tops your list, because He's the source of the list. He doesn't belong on your list because He's in a totally different category. Maybe it would be helpful to think about this in terms of another theologian named Anselm, who says that God must be someone than whom none greater we can conceive. That when we think about God, we must think about someone who is greater than anyone we can ever think of, because if we don't, we have far too small a view of God. I mean, who among us can declare the beginning from the end? Who among us can say that all of our plans are going to come to fruition? Like, it's no wonder Exodus 15:11 says, "Who among the gods is like you, Lord? Who is like you, majestic in holiness, awesome in glory, working wonders?" When God says there's no one like me, He's right. God is bigger than we think. Do you view Him that way? Do you think of God in those kinds of terms? See, because our tendency as human beings is to do something that an author I read in preparation for this series talked about, where he talked about our tendency is to domesticate God, is to declaw the lion, so to speak. Or another way that a theologian and reformer named Martin Luther puts it is he says that our thoughts are often way too human when it comes to God. Because if you don't think about God in these terms, I understand, I get it, because there's times where I don't either. Because this is intimidating, isn't it? Like, it's really intimidating. And because of that intimidation, like, we can face the temptation to diminish God, to bring Him down, to make Him in our own image, because it can feel like God is so great, He's so awesome, He's so big that why would He want anything to do with us? Can we even access Him? Does He want anything to do with us? Like, that's why one of the most prominent viewpoints of God that's existed throughout human history, that's as prominent as, like, it's as recent as a lot of the founding fathers of our country had an understanding of God that was called, or is called, deism. It's the understanding that God is so great and so awesome and so mighty that he wants nothing to do with us. We can't access him. Deism pictures God as a clockmaker when it comes to creation, where he kind of builds out the clocks and puts the gears in, turns the key and gets it started, and then steps back and has nothing to do with it and can't be bothered with it because he's so great. But that's not the God that we see in our text.